Let's think now about Ruth's story. Ruth and Orpah in verse 8 are two women who Naomi says have dealt kindly with her. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead, that's the two sons and Elimelech, and with me. Now the word kindly sounds a bit kind of watery and weak in English. Behind it is a Hebrew word which speaks of God's committed love. In the older versions of the Old Testament it's translated loving kindness. It's a word that speaks of really committed care and love and kindness. And that's what they have done for Naomi. And she wishes God to deal with them that way. Orpah decides to go home. When Naomi makes this speech to them, giving them reasons that it's not worth travelling with her to Judah, Orpah kisses her mother-in-law, verse 14, and then goes back. The kiss is a kiss of farewell. Now, the book of Ruth does not say that Orpah was wrong to do this. It just seems to think that Ruth is doing better. Orpah does well, but Ruth does better. Ruth commits herself to Naomi, and there's this little section in verses 14 to 17 where we hear Ruth's voice for the only time in this chapter. But notice first in verse 14 that the book says that Ruth clung to Naomi. Now that's a really strong word. It's the same word that's used in Genesis 2:24 when you get the biblical definition of marriage. A man leaves his father and mother, clings to his wife, and they become one flesh. We might translate it. The English versions tend to translate it is joined to, but it's the same word as here that Ruth clung to Naomi. It's a real person-to-person, wholehearted commitment. And she listens to Naomi's arguments in verses 12 and 13. Look, suppose I got married tomorrow. Girls, I wouldn't have a son soon enough for you to marry them, because the tradition was that if somebody died, if a man died without children, his brother was responsible for marrying the woman and having children in his brother's name. But I won't be able to give you a husband, Naomi says. She says the situation's bitter in verse 13. And then in verse 15, she says, look, your sister-in-law's gone back to her people and her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. Here's two of the return, go back uses. And Naomi's saying, look, Orpah's gone, so you should go too. And in her answer, Ruth really stresses that she wants to stay with Naomi. Just notice the number of times as I read this that Ruth says you and your. Do not press me to leave you or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die. There will I be buried. May the Lord do thus and so to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you. Ruth is saying really strongly, Naomi, I'm going to stick with you. I'm not going to give up. Ruth, it appears, has seen something about Naomi's God through Naomi's life and faith that's attractive, that's drawn her to want to be a follower of the God of Israel too. Now that's remarkable, isn't it? Because Naomi has had a grim time. She's lost her husband, she's lost her 2 sons. It's been awful. And she has reason to say that her experience has been bitter. But Ruth has seen something in this life as Naomi has lived and spoken and lived out her faith. Now that's something to pray for us, isn't it? That we'd be Naomi's to other people's Ruths, that they would see what it means to love and to serve Christ and decide they want to go with us too. And Ruth is not just committing herself to Naomi, but she says, your people shall be my people, and your God my God. And that is true even to the point of death. Where you die, I will die. Naomi's going to die first. She's probably 20 years older than Ruth. But Ruth is implying that when Naomi dies, she's going to stay put in Israel, back in Bethlehem, with Naomi's relatives. She's going to carry on worshipping the Lord even when Naomi's gone. Now that's a challenge to us about the wholeheartedness of our faith. Are we staking our lives on the Lord in the way Ruth does? Or are we just kind of saying, well, I'll get God's help with the bits of life I can't manage? Ruth is putting all her chips on that square. Ruth is committing herself wholeheartedly. She's going all in. Ruth is a remarkable young woman here. Maybe 20 at this stage. And that's what persuades Naomi. She sees that Ruth is determined, verse 18. Let's step back then. We've looked at the story through the 2 women's eyes. Let's step back and think about this as God's story, because that's what the whole book of Ruth is. God, remember, in verse 6, has sent a harvest to his people. The famine is not forever. The disaster that fell on Naomi in Moab is not forever. God is now doing something good for his people, and he invites their response. And Naomi's response is to return back to Bethlehem. And interestingly, God hears things that people say about him, even if they don't address him directly, because the God of Ruth, the God of Naomi, the God of Jesus Christ, is gracious and generous and will act. In verses 8 and 9, Naomi kind of addresses God indirectly. May the Lord deal kindly with you. The Lord grant that you may find security. She's not directly addressing God. She's saying, I kind of hope God might be good to you. Now, she doesn't know at this stage that Ruth will be blessed and that Ruth will be a blessing to Naomi by being her companion and by bearing a child ultimately. And Naomi doesn't know at all that her great-great-grandson will be King David, as chapter 4 verse 17 tells us. David is Ruth's great-grandson and Naomi's great-great-grandson. You see, God rules and God works out his purposes. And Naomi understands that. Naomi understands that God is in control of history. And she complains about it in verses 14 and 21. She says things are bitter. Verse 13 and verse 21. Things are bitter for me because of God. And in verse 21, she says, I went away full, but I've come back empty. And she speaks about God as the Almighty, twice in verses 20 and 21. But the Almighty's not done good things for her. He's dealt bitterly with me. He's brought calamity on me. Remember my story last week about cooking the Christmas dinner? Where if you walk into the kitchen halfway through the process, it looks like a mess. It looks like chaos. You're in the messy middle. You can't see the end from the middle. Some hours later, there'll be this amazing feast on the table of turkey and all the trimmings. Think back to how the disciples felt after Jesus was crucified. Those two men, Cleopas and his friend, who walked to Emmaus. Luke 24 verse 17 says that when the risen Jesus appeared and walked with them, and they didn't recognise him, their faces were downcast. They were incredibly sad. And Jesus says, "Why are you looking like this?" And they say in verses 18 to 24 that even though there's been a report from the women about seeing Jesus, they're utterly baffled because he was crucified. And the Romans are not amateurs at killing people. And it needed Jesus to open their eyes. He taught them from the scriptures in verses 25 and 26. He broke bread with them in 29 to 32. And then they recognised him. When they were in the messy middle, sad, puzzled, they didn't know what the end was going to be. But then, once Jesus had appeared and they knew him, they couldn't hold back. They run all the way back to Jerusalem in verses 33 and 34, and they have to tell the others. So think back to Naomi. Naomi is being invited, as we are, to trust God in the messy middle, to trust God in the middle of chaotic circumstances when things aren't going as we'd hoped. The story isn't over yet, and the commitment that Ruth makes to her and to the God of Israel is just one little green shoot starting to show the way God's working. Now this story gives us a way to pray amidst the COVID pandemic. Because like Naomi, even though things are bad, we recognise that God is sovereign and that God's in charge. And that means, like the psalmists, we can tell God how we are and how we're feeling. We can tell God what our concerns are. We can complain and say how awful it is. But the God of Israel, the God of Jesus, is also one who can change things. And if we talk to him and ask him, the time will come when he will.